Morning. My name is Bill Henry. I'm the councilman for the 4th District, chair of the Equity and Structure Committee. Thank you for joining us here in the City Council chambers. Just wanted to start off by saying that we have postponed the hearing of 2 of the charter amendments that we were originally supposed to hear this morning. Councilman Dorsey, who is the sponsor of one of them, is ill, and we have requested that he not be present in City Hall until he is definitely not contagious. And the other charter amendment was also dealing with the composition of the City Council, and we feel it makes sense to hear those together, so we will announce new hearings for both of those charter amendments at a later time. We will be hearing today City Council Bill 20-0489, Charter Amendment, Board of Estimates composition. To my left, we have Councilman Christopher Burnett of the 8th District, Vice Chair of the committee. To his left, we have Councilwoman Danielle McCray of the 2nd District, also a member of the committee. And then to my immediate right, we have Sam Johnson, staff to the committee. And to his right, we have Council President Brandon Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And to his right, we have Councilwoman Shannon Sneed of the 13th District. And we are also joined in chambers today by Nina Themelis and Matt Stegman of the Mayor's Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. And we're also joined by Tony DeFranco of the Department of Legislative Reference and Kaylin Young of the Council President's Office. We, since we're going to be starting off with the Board of Estimates Charter Amendment, I would like to turn the floor over to the Council President, sponsor of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee and for everyone for being here today. This piece of legislation is one that I think is critically important to bring Baltimore's government structure into the 21st century, but more importantly, to have it be more directly accountable to the citizens of Baltimore. We understand and know that in most cities across the country that doesn't even have a Board of Estimates. But we know that we cannot continue with the outdated, broken government structure that we have today. That is one that is ripe for corruption that we've seen time and time again through the BOE. And what we are trying to do here is make a better Baltimore government so that we can rebuild the trust with the citizenry and that the citizens of Baltimore can once again believe that this government is operating efficiently, effectively, but also with the trust of the citizens of Baltimore. We know that we've discussed this before. I myself have grown and matured in my opinion about this particular piece of legislation and wish that we all can come together and understand that this is needed in order for Baltimore to move forward and break away from the horrible past that we've had, especially in recent years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. We will now go to agency reports before the commencement of the hearing. I presided over a coin toss between Law and Finance. Law won, so we will take the report of the Law Department first.
Thank you. It's Vic Turvola from the City Law Department. We didn't have a legal problem with the bill. We discussed in a supplemental report operational concerns, which deals with a tie vote. What do you do when one of your 3 members recuses themselves and the other 2 members can't agree? So at this point, if they can't agree, then it would be a single vote against would probably carry the day. So I've talked to Legislative Reference about this, and Legislative Reference put an amendment, and I think it's on your desk, and we wouldn't have a problem with that particular amendment.
And just, okay, I know I saw this amendment. I'm sorry, apparently I saw it because it was a stack that was supposed to be distributed. My apologies.
Let me tell you what the amendment does. So
please.
The amendment basically says that if you recuse yourself, a designee can, if you're absent, what the charter says now, if you're absent, your designee can step in. This would add that if you recuse yourself, if there's a conflict of interest, and your designee can vote in your place, essentially.
And just to clarify, already it is practice that the council president can be well, I guess replaced. Let me start that sentence over. Already, it's practice that in the absence of the council president, the vice president can serve in that post for a given meeting. In the absence of the controller, the deputy controller can step in, and in the absence of the mayor can appoint any other officer or member of the mayor's personal staff to.
I'm not certain if the vice president of the council can step in. If you say they can, I just haven't checked that, but I think
feel
all the
like
other ones are there.
I feel like I've witnessed the council vice president
if
chairing the board.
If I'm not there, the council vice president chairs the board.
Okay, so, all right, thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I would just seek to clarify that the provision on the council president and the provisions on the comptroller already use the language disqualified, meaning if I can't vote on a particular
Right.
matter, then I can send my deputy or the vice president.
Gotcha.
So what this does, it just brings it all together in a clarifying way, we thought.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Any questions from the committee? Oh, I'm sorry, we've been joined by Councilman Leon Pinkett of the 7th District.
I have a question for the law department. If that is their only concern, Mr. Chair? Well, this amendment, is that the only, this amendment addresses all the concern that the law department has?
It does.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right. Thank you. Then we'll proceed to finance, which I suspect will be a more extensive exposition.
You assumed right. My name is Bob Sanamy, Budget Director for the city. Is it?
Oh, it is. Okay.
My name is Bob Sanamy, Budget Director for the city, representing the Department of Finance. And yes, I do have some extensive comments about this bill 20-0489 on the compositional side of the board of composition of the.
You need to lean in a little closer or tilt
Sorry.
it up or something because it's on, but we're not hearing you clearly.
Okay. So this bill, as mentioned, would reduce the size of the Board of Estimates from 5 people to 3 people. And just a reminder that this bill was, vetoed in 2015 by the previous mayor at the time, Mayor SRB at the time, and Finance opposed it then, and we still oppose it today. And I want to explain in detail why we think this is a bad idea. So there's a couple themes here. I think the first one is just the theme of executive authority and the ability to manage the city. So I think it's important to remember that the Board of Estimates, I think we generally think of it in terms of contracts and voting on contracts, and a lot of those issues get quite a bit of attention. But I think it's important to remember that the Board of Estimate also, they have to submit the ordinance of estimates to the city council. They have to vote on the ordinance and get it to the city council. They have to approve the carry forward of unspent appropriations into the next fiscal year. They have the power, the board has the power to set salary and wage scales for city employees. And the board also has the power to approve collective bargaining agreements. The Board of Estimates with those functions really is the centerpiece of a strong mayor form of government, of a strong executive structure for fiscal governance.
Can I interrupt you for a question? Sure. We talk a lot about the strong mayor system of government. Would you say it would be fair to characterize Baltimore City's government as really a strong Board of Estimates system in which the mayor controls the Board of Estimates?
I think that's fair to say. It's a strong mayor form, but the board is really one critical place where they put their plans in practice and plans into practice, essentially. In the way we see it is, in essence, the mayor's control of the board as it is today through those functions, not just the contracts, but the other functions that I mentioned, is really the way for them to implement their plan of action for the city. So using the budget as an example, I think that the structure makes sense. So the mayor has to do the work to develop the budget. They run it through the board. And then the budget gets set and approved by the board, and then it goes to the city council. For the 2 other members that are on the board that have influence, elected official, the council president is on the board. They can hold hearings on the budget, of course, when it gets to the council, and they can propose changes. The comptroller, who's also on the Board of Estimates, they have the authority, remember, to audit all of the city's financial transactions. So with whatever information they find, they can influence the process as well. Yes, they don't control the process, but they do have the ability to influence the outcome. By our thinking is that by reducing the board from a 5-person to a 3-person size, you really turn the strong mayor form of government completely on its head. This isn't just like a small reduction of power. You're basically turning it on its head. And what I mean by that is that the council president and comptroller together in a 3-person board could basically undo the entire ordinance of estimates or hold up the budget before it gets to the council and make unilateral changes to that document. And I think that's bad for a couple reasons. First is that the ordinance developed by professional staff in my shop, in finance, and within the Department of Planning, and it's just a reality that the council and the comptroller do not have the staff at their disposal to really reformulate the budget or formulate a budget. That's not how our system is set up. Separate, that budget process would be open to some maneuverings between those three officials, those 3 elected officials. And plus, the council and comptroller have very important roles for the city, but they're ultimately not responsible or accountable for executing the budget and actually ultimately delivering those services. I think in today's world, it's clear that the mayor is ultimately accountable and can be held accountable for those issues. So again, in practice, this would really turn into that strong mayor form of government completely on its head. I think it's fair to say that by diluting the authority of the executive to that degree, there would be significant red flags raised for our bond rating agencies. We have a AA bond rating, and I know we kind of drone on about that over and over when we come here, and you guys probably get a little bit annoyed of us saying that over and over again, but I need to emphasize that bond rating is a signal of strength. It's a signal to the outside world that we're a safe place to invest. That bond rating allows us to go to the capital markets and raise money for capital projects. And the governance structure we have, we've been told directly in the reports that Moody's and S&P put together for us that the governance structure we have is a reason today that we have the fiscal stability that we have, even despite enormous challenges that this city has faced over the past couple of decades. In light of that, too, I'd remind the council that by reducing the executive authority at this time, we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. And we have potentially new mandated education spending coming soon. We're very likely, if we're not already in the beginning waves of an economic downturn. And by reducing the mayoral authority in the budget process, it's going to make it really difficult to position ourselves to respond to those challenges. And again, I understand why there would be there's a need to have more discussion and more collaboration on financial decisions. But when you're in a crisis, you need somebody to understand what's going on and to act very quickly and swiftly, or else you can get into a lot of trouble very quickly. And I think the last recession is a good demonstration of that. So that's just all the executive authority pieces together. The second issue is something that Law had mentioned. It was on voting deadlocks. A 3-member board could find itself completely stymied on important matters. They could just be deadlocked. With a 3-member board, even if you have one person that abstains, you would have a deadlock where you might have the board unable to act. And again, on things like contracts and approving the budget, even if there are disagreements, there has to be a vehicle to keep things moving through, and the resulting delays in either awarding contracts or taking personnel actions or even getting the budget through to the city council to review, we think would negatively impact city services. The third point, I think, is the city solicitor and the public works director do play a role on the board. The solicitor does occasionally provide, some kind of legal guidance on the board's decisions. The director of public works provides a lot of crucial information on the big contracts that come before the board. A lot of the big contracts happen to be through the Department of Public Works. So having that person there, just from a practical standpoint, I think is helpful. One final point is we often hear that our board, we should make our board like the Board of Public Works at the state level. And I think that's not ideal for a couple of reasons. There are a couple differences between the way the Board of Public Works works and our Board of Estimates works. First, the Board of Public Works is chaired by the governor, not the council president like it is here. Second, and the most importantly, the Board of Public Works does not review the governor's budget before it goes to the legislature. So even though there's that control at the state level for other things like contracts, it doesn't have to get through the board to get to the legislature. The governor puts the budget directly to the legislature. Here, you could have the possibility that the budget gets completely hung up because the comptroller and the city council president could, in certain instances, and not always, but in certain instances, could hold the process up completely. The Board of Public Works also approves contracts over $200,000. Our threshold is lower than that. And the Board of Public Works also does not have authority over positional class and comp. And that's a difference, again, between our board.
sorry.
Class and compensation.
Oh,
So again, all personnel actions have to go through our Board of Estimates. Those are things that could also get held up. So in sum, I would say, again, because of the executive authority that we have in the current process, because we have a means for resolving deadlocks, because we have the city council, the city solicitor, I'm sorry, and the public works director there, which is helpful, and because we're really not like the Board of Public Works, or the city is not like the state in those critical ways, I think in sum, those are really reasons why we would oppose this bill. And just to conclude, I think that, from our perspective, the fiscal governance structure that has been established in the city charter, I think we have to admit that it has served the city really well from a financial perspective. It's a strong executive model. It allows the mayor, again, to propose and to execute their plan of action. And it provides the reason to understand that the mayor is accountable for those things. It does, in our opinion, provide enough power to the council president and the comptroller to influence the decisions. There are places where they can influence the outcome. It does not provide equal power for those members, but nor should it necessarily. There should be one executive, and then there should be other controls on that executive. And I think that this bill really essentially undoes that entire structure of government and is a really dangerous bill for us to consider this quickly. And I would just also close by saying that these charter amendments collectively, I understand that there has been recent scandals and it has raised questions about the way we do business, but I think this change goes beyond some of those more ethical issues, and it really undoes the entire mechanism of our strong mayor form of government. And I think further, if you combine this bill with some of the other bills that are still being considered, these are, I think, radical changes, and they could really leave this place unmanageable going forward. And I think, as we're in an election cycle now, we want to make sure that the mayor, whoever that might be going forward, has the ability to kind of take the city forward. But in combination, a lot of these amendments could just make this place stall and come to a halt and mean that we cannot respond to challenges quickly. So each of these bills alone, I think, would be a pretty large departure from our current practice, but combined, the unintended consequences is this could be disastrous for the city from a fiscal standpoint. So those are my comments, and I'd be happy to take any questions from the council.
Thank you. So first, I have two, comments and observations. One is, speaking just for myself, I never get tired of hearing how great our bond rating is. But I also would comment that I would think you could still retain the advantages of the city solicitor and the director of public works expertise and input by requiring them to be at Board of Estimates meetings and allowing them to speak without actually giving them a vote. But the question that I would ask, based on your remarks, is if the bill were amended so that the mayor chaired the board, like in the Board of Public Works, and if the charter were subsequently amended so that the budget came directly from the Budget Bureau / the mayor to the council and bypassed the Board of Estimates, would you then acknowledge that the parallels between the two were sufficient and that it would not create a more dangerous structure of government than the state has been maintaining with, I believe, a pretty good bond rating also?
Mr. Chair, can I add to that?
Oh, I'm sure. Okay. We're going to do Council President and then Councilman Pinkett.
I just wanted to add to the councilman's point, but also Mr. Sinema, if not that, what if the bill was amended to say that if the budget is not approved by the board by a specific date, that the mayor can directly send it to the city council? I have more questions, but you were on that point, so I wanted to.
Yeah, I think those would help. I still think that the structure today, and I hear the point about a lot of places don't even have this Board of Estimates structure at all, and we've thought about, do you even need to have a Board of Estimates if certain authorities are already delegated to city agencies? But again, those agencies still report up through, are still executive branch agencies. So I think those provisions that you're talking about would help, but I still think because so many of our provisions are financial provisions, like I said, carrying forward spending from one year to the next, approving personnel actions, those are generally considered executive branch actions. And so even if we made those changes to help keep the budget moving, I still think there would be problems, and there could be things that would get held up at the Board of Estimates that would be a problem with a 3-member board. Again, that wouldn't happen all the time, but there's definitely the risk that that could happen frequently, including contracts and personnel actions and carry forwards, even if you cleared the budget from that hurdle, which I appreciate. And again, if in the places where there is no Board of Estimates, those functions are delegated to the Human Resources Department or Finance, who all report up through the mayor. So it's still an executive function, in my opinion.
I understand. Council President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Sinema, thank you as always for all your hard work. This is rare for you and I to disagree. I am going to have to disagree with you on a few points. First and foremost, while I do think that you guys at Budget and Finance have done a great job of fiscally making sure the city is in good health, I think that if you ask the average citizen of Baltimore, at least in the last 35 years, which is all I can talk about, if the city government structure that we have been functioning, the answer is going to be resoundingly no. And a good, bad, or indifferent, the citizens hold the council president, the council, responsible for these things when they don't have any power over them, right? For example, I'm held responsible for every contract that goes to the Board of Estimates, even if I don't vote for it. And a couple of questions for you. First and foremost, knowing that I don't know of another city that has, a Board of Estimates system remaining. I know New York used to have one and it's gone. And thinking about how DC has a strong bond rating and they don't have a Board of Estimates system. And in some of these places, you're right, they're agencies, and depending on the city, the agency report to the council manager or who reports to the whole board of whatever kind of system they have. But what we have to understand is that we do have to worry about the corruption because, look, good, bad, or indifferent, if Mayor Young, when he was council president, and Comptroller Pratt decided they were going to vote no on these contracts for these folks because they knew they were involved in a shady book deal, guess what? Still would have happened. They still would have gotten those contracts. We have to have a better system that protects us from that kind of corruption, and also understand that we have to evolve. I'm never going to believe that we have to keep a system that we've had since the 1800s simply because that's the only thing that we know how to do. That's the problem with Baltimore. We refuse to look around at best practices from around the world and adapt to understand and come to the table about how we can work together. I think the councilman pointed out some very good points, but a couple of questions that I have for you. Can you tell me other cities that have the Board of Estimates or a similar structure to the Board of Estimates?
So we've looked at other big cities. There's not a comparable for that from what we've seen. But just to reiterate their earlier point, in those places, they delegate some of the authorities for some of the functions I talked about, like procurement, for example, to their purchasing department, and they have very high thresholds, and they let that person run a professional process where there's no interference. So I don't necessarily think so the answer to that is no, and I don't think it's the structure of the Board of Estimates here. It's the fact that there is a lot of direct involvement, whereas a lot of other cities just defer that to their professional, folks on their staff. And again, they report through the executive, so there's still the chance that there's going to be problems, but they defer those things to their professional staff, and there's not that interference on a week-to-week basis. So no, it's not there, but also our structure is strange. And if we were proposing a structure that wiped out the Board of Estimates completely, but kept a strong mayor executive form of government, we would definitely be willing to work on that. But this basically just turns it completely on its head, in our opinion.
And I think that's the second point of what I want to get at, because as you know, I'm not trying to take away the strong mayor form of government. I'm trying to have us have a better strong mayor form of government, one that I think is more accountable, one that's more based in 21st century policies and practices. So to further that point, in those other places that have these other systems, or in a place where they have a Board of Estimates or similar system, how have their bond rating been impacted?
So, I mean, there's so many factors that go into the bond rating, so we'd have to look at those individually. I mean, there's a whole host of things that go into that in terms of the strength of your revenue streams, you know, whether the city's growing or declining, whether there are other challenges outstanding. But they do specifically speak to in the reports, and happy to share the information if you'd like. Outside of those general comments, there is a section about fiscal governance and whether the structure of government is geared towards making sure that there's good, sound financial decisions that are made. And for better or for worse, what they say about our form of government is that it does provide significant flexibility for the city to respond to challenges quickly. And because that there is, you know, a strong amount of authority in the executive. And I think just to the earlier point about the corruption, I mean, you know, I don't necessarily, this bill addresses that. I mean, there are clearly, we have seen occasionally there are conflict of interest, you know, issues that come to the board, but this doesn't necessarily change that. Each of those members could still potentially have conflicts of interest. It might just be different conflicts of interest or different members that would have their interest in going through. So I don't see this structural change as necessarily.
Well, I think that
addressing that.
let's just put it this way, simply put. I can only remember of one time since I've been in city government that one of the mayoral appointees voted against the mayor. That's never going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. Right. So we have to accept that as reality, and more importantly, Mr. Sinema, we have to understand, when I did my town halls this summer, the number one thing that the citizens complained about and thought, and the number one thing that they supported was this, because they don't believe that the board, that the public works director or the city solicitor should be determining how their money is being spent, because they did not elect those people. And while you and I can get into a wonky policy discussion about how it's different than the state, they don't get that. They see that at the state, it's 3 people. The state's able to function. The state has a great bond rating. And what they would expect for us is what my next thing to you is how we can come to the table together to make changes to this legislation that make it something that doesn't just throw out the baby with the bathwater, but that also makes it so it's more directly accountable to the citizens by having this board be the people that the citizens elect. Because there's no solution. I don't know of any solution that I can see that keeping the existing system won't allow it to be ripe for corruption, ripe for mistreatment, ripe for abuse, because we've been through this now twice, right? So what kind of, in addition to the stuff that Councilman Henry and I have been talking about, what kind of things are you willing to come to the table with to make this something that we can do? Because I am a staunch supporter of it, clearly, that we can do this and still not structurally change the form of government, but make it more accountable and more transparent directly to the citizens.
I mean, yeah, just in general, you know, we would certainly be willing to listen to those ideas. I think, again, my instinct is that some of the issues that we see are like conflict of interest issues potentially, and there's ways to address that. I would think, and I don't have those with me, but I would want to understand those without undoing, you know, the entire structure of government that we have. Because again, I think the unintended consequence, as it's written, is that you could stall a lot of things. And again, we're entering a time when we're going to have a lot of challenges. And yes, there's times when people on the council or disagree with the mayor, and there's times that I disagree with the mayor. I worked for the mayor, and there's been times over my career that I've been like, well, I don't agree with that decision.
I've seen that one a few times.
But, and that's just life. You know, you kind of move on, and you have to kind of come here and show a good face and move on. But I think the risk is that you just kind of shut down business over these kind of all these officials being involved in all that business. If anything, you should be having them further away from kind of the routine business that goes through the city, and then they should be voting on really the big impactful type thing. So I think that's what we've seen differently, is that again, other cities that don't have a board of estimates, they delegate a lot of purchasing authority to their finance department, to their purchasing people, and there's no, and the elected officials don't necessarily vote on those things, which causes the problem. So I would say the problem is probably more even that we have a board of estimates rather than it should change the size, if anything. Because again, it's geared towards an executive model of government, and that I think is a good thing overall.
So what my last thing, Mr. Chair, is that because you know me, I like to do things responsibly and in time, and also we're bringing everyone to the table. So for you guys, the my ask of you is to come to the table to figure out how we can improve this to make it work with the kind of suggestions that myself and Councilman Henry have started to talk about, so that we can put forth to the voters the best option. Because I, like you, believe that totally doing it away actually leads to more ripe corruption, because there will be no elected officials that see this thing. There won't be people that the citizens can hold directly accountable. But we have to put forth a better system that where it's not just some one person walks in and makes a decision and that two people are just going to do whatever they say. We can make this bill a 3-member board work for our system that we have today. We just have to do the tough work of getting together to make it happen.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think just to respond to that, I think, you know, the fear of getting rid of the Board of Estimates completely is the lack of transparency. So I think there's ways to keep the system, but to have the transparency. And just, you know, for those of you who were here at the prior hearing, I mean, we started off our comments on all these bills by saying that we would support a review commission, because I think these issues are really complicated. And it takes gathering the best practices and gathering all the information. And yes, we can come to the table with ideas, but, you know, we have day jobs, we have a budget to get through in the next couple of months. We don't have, you know, unlimited amount of time to research these things, which is why we think a broader commission would help to pull those best practices. People that have experience in other jurisdictions could say, this is what would work for your city. So I don't take our opposition as that we're not willing to work on it, but given the you know, how quickly this has moved, we had to basically just be very strong and say that from a financial standpoint, we think this is bad, and then we'd be happy to find those other ideas. But I think a broader group of people looking at this would be helpful in this issue in particular.
And we're not moving this. This is not a bill that we're moving quickly, and we're not moving this today. That's why we're saying that we can get this done between now and July, and we're going to do that. We just have to do the tough work of doing it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Sinema. Before I recognize Councilman Pinkett, I just want to remind people to please use the microphone when you're speaking, even if you're just answering a question, because we are on video for this. So, Councilman Pinkett. And he'll be followed by Councilman Burnett.
Mr. Chair, my question for Law Department is in reference to their report. So if there are questions that are specific to finance, I don't mind deferring until, you know, those questions are asked. And
Okay. Well, is your question for finance? Yeah. Okay. Then I'll come back. I'll come back to you. Okay. Councilman Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So you stated that the current structure does lend influence to the council president and the comptroller. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So what we meant by that is that in the current structure, you know, the council president chairs the Board of Estimates, and then at least in the budget process, of course, the budget comes back to the city council. And so in that public meeting each week, they can definitely influence. They can call things to attention. They can vote against things, and it might not mean that it stops it, but they can definitely bring attention to certain issues if they think there are problems. The same is true of the comptroller sitting on the Board of Estimates. And, you know, keep in mind too that like we said in the bill response, the comptroller has the responsibility for auditing all of the city's financial transactions. So they come across information that they can bring to light in that process. But the process today at least allows things to keep going if there is some kind of disagreement, but they can bring issues to light, including if there are conflicts of interest, if there are ethical issues that they think they have found, and all those things can be made public through their role on the Board of Estimates.
Okay.
So again, our argument is
So
there's
it's like
there's
the
influence.
bully
They can't
pulpit
control.
you're thinking is valuable. A valuable presence is sort of the pulpit to be able to raise issues.
Yep.
The,
So they
the
can
power to
influence it.
publicly shame is considerable.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I do it all the time. Okay. And wouldn't the argument that well, maybe less so for the comptroller, but for the council president also wouldn't have, like the argument you made earlier about not having access to finance staff and financial analysts, wouldn't that already apply to the comptroller to some degree and absolutely to the council president in the current structure that we have?
So you mean that they do
So
have...
the argument that you made was it's important because the mayor, it needs to be centered around the mayor because the mayor has access to a tremendous amount of staff who have financial expertise. wouldn't the current structure that we have now with those two elected officials on the board who don't have access to the staff, wouldn't the same apply or the same logic apply now? I mean, I guess it supports your argument to get rid of the board, but I think it makes a stronger argument to get rid of it than to keep it, because it sounds like we're saying they don't have access to staff now, and they don't really have any ability to influence the ultimate outcome now.
So I would say on the budget side, those elected officials don't have access to staff to do all of the detailed work of formulating a budget. I think that's typical for any form of government. The executive's going to have the budget formulation process. I mean, the comptroller does have at their disposal some folks with financial expertise on the audit side. It's not necessarily.
That's what I meant, less so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's less so on budget formulation. It's more so on audit side. So again, they can bring to light issues that they've seen. If they've done an audit and they've seen an outage in an agency, they can bring that to light either at the board or through that process. And raise it, and those are things that could get considered. Remember, when we release the preliminary budget, which will happen at the end of or 1st of April, and there's a period of time between that and between them when the final budget goes when it's a public process. I mean, people can come and bring their information to light, and I would say the reason we go to those hearings and listen to the taxpayers night and listen to the board is if there are things that we think are wrong, and that feedback makes its way back to us or through the mayor. I mean, we always meet internally between the time the preliminary budget comes out and between the time the final budget is due, and we talk about all the feedback we've gotten and if we should make changes. And so that opportunity is there.
Do you share that information, that feedback in internal meetings with the other two elected officials on the board?
And that's what I want to jump in, because I think
Councilwoman Sneed.
that's the problem to me, is that if you're saying they're making decisions, but they're not a part of the conversation when folks are being briefed, that doesn't make sense. If you're briefing the mayor on something, but the other two are voting on something, they should be a part of the conversation to have the full picture if someone is already doing the work. It doesn't take a whole nother department or another agency to do it when you're already delivering.
Well, yeah, what I mean by that is there is when the preliminary budget comes out, there is a hearing of the Board of Estimates with all the agency heads present where anybody can ask questions and critique, and if there's a problem, and if there have been occasionally things that come up there where it's like, okay, this is just not a good idea, this is not going to fly, there have been times when that budget has been changed before it even gets to the council. So again, my point is that the mayor should still be the lead on the budget, but that there's opportunities for the other elected officials to influence the process, and that's one of them.
Okay. All right. Councilwoman Sneed, was that your question, or did you have another?
The other question was, you keep mentioning the challenges, and I'm like, what challenges are we going to have that we haven't had in the last 50 years or the last 100 years? What are these challenges that are so big that are coming that it would enable us not to make good decisions?
So there's a bill there's a bill in the General Assembly now that's going to likely pass, that's going to require the city to pay tens of millions of dollars more per year for education, and it could grow to over $100 million per year over the next decade. I mean, that's an enormous challenge. I mean, there's a lot of discussion going on publicly about it. I can tell you, my professional judgment, it is an enormous challenge. It will be an enormous challenge if that bill passes for us to make our commitment to the school. So that's just one. I think we'll also likely be entering a time when we're going to hit a bump in the economic recovery. I mean, we're 10, now almost 11 years into just consistent growth. For those of you who were around for the last recession, I mean, it's ugly here when that happens. I mean, we can't control our revenues when we go into an economic downturn. There's nothing I can do to stop income tax receipts from being lower, to stop transfer and recordation tax receipts from being lower, to stop property values from declining in value, and that means we just have less resources to do all the things that we want to do. So in terms of challenges, I think we're very likely within the next, probably even within the next year or two, between the education spending, if it ultimately does pass and make its way through, and whatever happens with the general economy, we're likely to face significant financial challenges. I think we just have had a couple years where it hasn't really been that bad. But I started here, I lived through the last recession, and for those of you who are here at the council meeting, it was ugly. There were cuts that had to be made. There was a lot of back and forth, and it was just a situation where you just can't afford to do everything that you want to do, and you have to make these really difficult choices. So I think we're very likely to face those challenges within the next couple of years. And yes, it's not different. I would say it's not different from what we faced before, but I think it's probably one of the most significant financial challenges we'll face will happen in the next couple of years, is my judgment.
Councilwoman McCray?
Use some pretty strong language. Disastrous from a fiscal standpoint. You also said one other item about how it would negatively impact city services. Can you elaborate on how changing the composition of the board will negatively impact city services?
Sure. So the reason I said that, and I stand by that, I believe pretty strongly in this, is that, again, there are a lot of routine things that go through the Board of Estimates that have, there's the potential for more interference rather than less interference with a 3-person board. So I understand the perspective that with a 5-person board, a lot of things kind of sail through and there's not a lot of discussion about those. But the counter to that is that a lot of those things are routine and just go through. You're introducing the ability for a 3-person board and potentially 2 people to team up and just stop certain things from going through. And that includes not only the budget, but that it could include contracts or personnel actions, things that are needed to keep the city government functioning. So I think if there is that holdup or that deadlock at the board on certain items, it could negatively impact city services.
Okay. All right, Mr. Senemy, thank you very much. We're going to go back to the Law Department, and Councilman Pinkett had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and please excuse me if this was already asked. Apologize for being a little tardy. I heard the Law Department say that they didn't have any other issues with the bill. And I was just curious, was the issue related to the potential for the Maryland Open Meetings Act? Was that mentioned? The fact that the makeup of the Board of Estimates would cause just about any conversation between.
I think that's always an issue that the Law Department always is aware of. That when several of you, when there's just a small number of you that are on a committee or on a board. Especially in a place like this where everybody's office is down the hall from one another, it's easy to walk into somebody's office and start talking about lunch and then suddenly, but what about that bill? And suddenly you're into a policy discussion that under that law should have been, you can't have that discussion unless you've had notice and an opportunity for other people to have. And I think when you have 3-member committees, same issue, this 3-member boards, it really does put a real pressure, real dampen on how you can communicate with one another. If you just can't walk into somebody's office and have a conversation because you have a quorum present. So that's essentially what the problem here is. And it's not so much when we talk about, well, how does this compare to the Board of Public Works? They work in different buildings. They're not down the hall from one another. And you guys are much more sociable generally. And there is a lot of conversation that goes on. So I worry about, our department worries about that a lot, but of course, we're not behind every door as you walk into. So we don't really understand what's going on.
And I like it that way.
But that is a situation that I think is a concern, and thank you for raising it, but yeah, for whatever it's worth.
Are you good?
Yes.
Because I actually wanted to follow up on your question. Reminded me of an issue that had come up. I was in a conversation with someone about this very issue of, well, if you have only 3 members of the Board of Estimates, then does that mean the mayor can never just meet with the council president, or the council president can never just meet with the comptroller? And that made me wonder, are cabinet meetings for the mayor treated as public open meetings?
No, not usually. If you just have your appointed officials sitting in the room, then it's not an open meetings because it's basically an administrative operation.
Right, but since the mayor, the director of public works, and the city solicitor are 3 members and therefore a quorum of the Board of Estimates, shouldn't any time they are together in a meeting
that would trigger it?
That would seem
because you have a quorum present of the Board of Estimates.
Does one of those officials not come to cabinet meetings to avoid triggering that quorum?
I don't know how that operates.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I guess what I would ask for is, could the Law Department opine on whether or not there are currently open meeting issues involved in the fact that the current composition of the Board of Estimates allows for a quorum whenever the mayor is meeting with his own agency head.
I don't know if you would actually need an opinion, because if essentially anytime 3 members of a 5-member body are together, you have a quorum. So, and I don't know how often that happens, but when it does happen, you have a quorum present, and it should follow the Open Meetings Act.
Okay, all right. Do we have any other questions from the committee? Oh, Councilman Burnett.
Yep. Thank you. So sorry to go back to finance, but so when we're talking about the budget process, and I think the council president did a pretty good job at sort of painting a picture of what the status quo has looked like current in our very recent history and the feedback that we're getting from communities. I would also add that, you know, I did a Civics 101 class the other night in my district, and when I got to the slide on the composition of the Board of Estimates and sort of the flow of the construction of power, folks were upset about that. They were shocked to hear it because they thought, well, we're electing 15 of you to be on this council. Why aren't you all a part of that conversation? And so I would just note that there is, you know, as representatives of the people and the perspectives of the people, I feel compelled to throw that out there, that there has not been a time where I've had conversations about the current composition that people felt uncomfortable that there was so much power in one particular position when we are electing 2 other individuals to be on that board, and the council writ large also is not a part of the budget making process. I mean, you even said it that, you know, the board approves it, they make changes before it gets to the council. And I think when we talk about that process, I think this conversation of equity comes to mind, and not only just the equitable distribution of power in City Hall and the ability to get things done, but a lack of equity in the process of drafting a budget itself. So can you speak to the equity lens used by the Finance Department and the BOE in crafting the budget and when looking at the process of budget formulation before it gets to the other elected officials in this building?
Sure. So a lot of these comments we made on the previous bill that was heard a couple of weeks ago about the ordinance of estimates formulation, I think, you know, the way I like to think of this is there's a lot of things in the budget that's really not exciting, frankly. There's money for pension contributions. There's money to pay retiree health benefits. There's money to pay for the maintenance of buildings. There's money that goes into reserve funds that we know we can use in future emergencies. So I would say, you know, when you look at the budget, more than half of the budget is just things like that, where you need the professional staff, and it's really not, I would say it's not even policy choice type stuff. It's just making sure that the budget is accurate, that it reflects the reality of what we're going to face in that next year. So I think I don't think it's typical that an executive is going to play the largest role in the budget, and I agree that there can be conversations about how to bring feedback into the process earlier in the process, and that's okay. But, you know, the council, the power that they have currently in the budget process, they can influence the process. I mean, last year we made adjustments to the process, to the final budget that was passed. We agreed to make adjustments because there was discussion with the council at that later stage in the process. So I think, you know, I think there is, I understand that there's need for more collaboration. I do think the counter to that is that you can have a situation where there just ends up being too many cooks in the kitchen and you have to make a decision. And so that's why I think it's better to have the executive be the one that leads the budget and puts that together, because somebody ultimately has to make that decision, and not everybody's going to be satisfied. And then the council can collectively say, here are the things that we disagree with, and negotiate with the mayor at that point in the process. And I don't think that's pretty typical for most budget processes for most governments, for better or for worse.
And I don't want to belabor the point, but I'd also argue that, I mean, to the last point you made, that the council can have some role. I mean, you also, with the finance department, it's not you, the finance department position on a separate charter amendment that would give the council more authority over line items in the budget. It was also stated that you also didn't think, the finance department didn't think it was a good idea to allow that to go forward either. For, again, the lack of, I think, the similar position, we don't have access to the finance department and the analysts, or direct access. Obviously, we can call and request information. But I just think it speaks to a maintaining of the status quo that I would argue that, yes, from your perspective, from a finance perspective, that bond rating and everything else that you look at for fiscal health is critical, but I just rehashed the president's point earlier that I don't think that that is the view of the prevailing view that things are going well financially or operationally in the city of Baltimore. If you ask the citizens of Baltimore, and I would just say that you know we're hearing that every single day that people do want structural change, and the more that they learn about the current structure, I think there's. I don't think if this was up for a referendum with an educated populace as to what we're proposing, what we currently have, what we're trying to do, without any additional commentary, most people I've talked to have been like, that's crazy. Like, what do you mean you don't have a role in moving things in the budget? What do you mean you don't get the budget until we get the budget, or have any influence or perspectives on it when it's being formulated in December and January, but you get it in April? People are shocked by that. And I think that's where we as their representatives are putting forth ideas to meet the needs and hear that feedback and take action on it. And I think that's what's being proposed. I do look forward to more conversation on this, but just wanted to throw out a little more commentary on where I'm coming from in my position on this and where I think others are who are supportive of this.
I think that's totally fair. I mean, the challenge with any budget process is somebody has to make the final decision, say this is the budget, and on it goes. And so, we have conversations with every mayor since I've been here. I've served under 4 now. We have all kind of conversations about what's the right way to engage the council in the process and when, and that doesn't have to be the same from mayor to mayor. But ultimately, there has to be some accountability in somebody to say this is a budget that's fiscally responsible. And the reason we oppose the other bill is there is the potential that people can put forward amendments in that bill without a revenue source and say this is a program we want to do. And again, collectively that could be passed, but ultimately the mayor has to be accountable that the overall plan financially makes sense. And so I think it's still good to have that control at that level to make sure, and again, they have us at their disposal to kind of guide them on what that looks like.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. We are going to recess the hearing on City Council 20-0489, and this charter amendment will be added to the list of other charter amendments that we have begun the public hearing on, but now we will just be taking additional input from citizens as we hold additional work sessions on these charter amendments for the rest of the month. I think next we're going to move to voting sessions for several of the charter amendments that we have already had hearings on. After deliberation and consultation, we've identified 4 of the charter amendments that we have previously heard that either had little or no opposition, and we're going to take up some amendments on them now at this point. We make certain I have all of the appropriate ones. For the first one, 19-0380, Charter Amendment vetoes. This alters the threshold for the number of votes the council would need to override a mayoral veto. We have an amendment to this from the Finance Department, which would effectively remove the existing provision in the charter amendment that removes the existing provision in the charter allowing for a line item veto of the ordinance of estimates. Mr. Senemy, would you like to discuss this amendment?
Sure, I can speak to this and explain it. We see this as I see this as kind of a technical adjustment, frankly, because the reason the line item veto, exists in the charter, we believe, is that when the ordinance of estimates goes to the city council, it is one bill. It's one giant bill with a bunch of different line items for each individual agency and program, and the line item veto allows that if there's a disagreement, if the council vetoes an individual line item of the budget, which they can do because they can reduce those lines, the mayor can just veto that individually and not hold up the entire budget bill over one particular item. So without this provision, we see it as if the council were to veto just one item, the mayor would have to, I'm sorry, if the council were to cut one item, the mayor would have to veto the entire bill, which doesn't make sense that they'd want to veto their entire budget bill. So we see it as a way that this provision keeps the disagreements on the budget to those individual areas, again, rather than tying up the entire bill, which again is keeping with our theme on a lot of these bills, is that we don't want to, we don't want to stop the functioning of city government for small disagreements. So that was our idea on this one.
Thank you. Question for the law department. A hypothetical, if under the current charter, the council made a cut to the ordinance of estimates, or maybe made 17 cuts to the ordinance of estimates, but the mayor was okay with 16 of them, but there was one that they weren't happy with, they could do this line item veto. If the line item veto were not an option and the mayor had no other tool but to veto the entire bill, what would happen if the council passes a budget and the mayor vetoes it?
It goes. We're required by law to pass a budget by July 1st. So if we don't pass a budget by July 1st, then I suppose we'd be subject to actions by a taxpayer to do your job, which that sort of a suit said, do your job, and the court would say you have to pass a budget.
So just a quick clarification on that. We, meaning the mayor and city council, are required to pass a budget. If the council, and this is where terminology is a little slippery, and I want to make sure, the council passes a budget, the mayor signs or enacts it. So if we pass a budget and the mayor vetoes it, can't the council respond, we passed a budget?
Ultimately, the city needs a budget. So you're into limbo with that question. I mean, essentially, the city needs a budget. That's what the law says. So we need to find a way out of that morass to pass a budget. And if it goes past July 1, all bets are off. We don't know exactly what happens under those circumstances.
I don't think we can predict what a court would do in a mandamus action, but that would be the route that would be taken to force either the mayor or the mayor and city council to act one way or another. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that there couldn't be a new budget. The budget is the budget that they come up with, so it's not like the court could order, and I'm pretty sure that the case law would support this, but you can't come up with a new budget at that point. The budget that has come out and was before the council is what you have to work with.
The reason I ask is because and this kind of goes back to it's easier for one person to be accountable than a group of people. It's easier to focus. I can see how a judge might say to a mayor, you shouldn't veto this bill, or you should enact this bill. I don't know how a judge comes to the city council and says, you must muster the political will among your body to override this veto.
Yeah, the conversation here is that the judge is not going to be telling either one of an elected official what they must do. Ultimately, we have a law that says the city has to have a budget. The political process that goes into it is really kind of beyond the judge's skill.
And I think what has been said in some of the case law, or maybe it was our old city solicitor opinions, was that you basically be asked to sit down and go through this process over and over again until you pass a budget.
Okay, I get that. So this is where I'm looking for a little bit of guidance. I would think, given that, it would be beneficial to the city to not have a high threshold for overriding a mayoral veto, because a higher threshold increases the possibility that we are stuck in that potential limbo.
So you're making an argument for the line item veto. I see.
I'm making an argument for the charter amendment, meaning that whether we have if we didn't have the line item veto, we would be less likely to be stuck in the. Let me back up. You're making the case that removing the line item veto increases the chances that we're stuck in budget limbo. I'm saying that, but a lower threshold for overriding a veto reduces the chances that we're stuck in budget limbo, and so I would make the case that they cancel each other out.
But doesn't that cut both ways in that argument? Like if it's a higher threshold for a veto, then it's less likely that that they can override the veto and the budget goes into effect?
So if the mayor vetoes the budget,
Right.
does the budget go into effect?
Oh,
Yeah, right. That's the thing.
I didn't think about that. You're right.
Yeah.
I don't know what, I hadn't thought about that eventually.
So, okay, so I think we understand, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Segman? Oh, okay. So, I think we understand the amendment. Is there anyone interested in making a motion on it? All right, seeing no motion, I would be happy to take a motion on the charter amendment itself.
Move the charter amendment.
Councilman Burnett moves the charter amendment. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilwoman McCray. Mr. Johnson will call the roll.
Member Henry,
Yes.
Member Burnett,
Yes.
Member McCray. This bill moves forward to the council meeting on March 9th.
Okay. Thank you. We will now move on to the next one, which is City Council 19-0381, Charter Amendment, Removal of Elected Officials. I believe Councilman Burnett has some amendments for this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to note that I wanted to discuss the amendments today, but did not intend to move the amendments today.
Okay.
Yeah, the first time I think folks are seeing them. They're looking for copies of them. We're not going to move them today. But I think we've already had the hearing on the bill.
Oh, is this him? I think this is the stack.
It should
Yeah,
be.
this is the stack. Okay.
Yeah. You want me to talk about the amendments or we've already talked about
We've already talked about the bill. You can
Okay.
just talk about the amendments.
Okay, so in hearing feedback on this particular proposed charter amendment from both community members, people across the city, one of the items that I kept rehashing or coming up in these conversations was folks wanted they felt like the process, the triggering process was only in City Hall and among the council itself. And while we are not a state that can do recall elections or a jurisdiction that can do recall elections, I heard them. And so what the proposed amendments do is trigger the process, not the removal, but triggers the process for review, which is already laid out in the bill, which would take up an investigation by the Inspector General and or the Council's Legislative Investigations Committee before any vote. With this provision, these three amendments, which basically, if you line them up in the amendment, basically apply a public process for the removal of a city council member, the comptroller, mayor, in creating a petition process that if similar to what we would do for amending the charter via referendum. So the number that we aligned it with was 20% of the qualified voters, which is in alignment with what it takes to get a charter amendment on the ballot, according to the research we got from Legislative Reference. 20% of the population, and so in trying to align with existing law, this is what we're proposing to amend, to trigger the process in the provision.
I have a question, I think, for DLR, because my understanding is that there's about 300,000 voters in Baltimore City, and so 20% would be 60,000. But when we've done petition drives in the past, my understanding is that the threshold they were trying to hit was 10,000.
It's 20%.
You got to use.
It's 20% or 10,000, whichever is greater.
Ah, really?
Yes.
Well.
Yes.
Okay. I will. Okay. I'll look into that. I may have been misinformed previously.
I can probably quickly pull up the
I would be interested in doing that. I say that because 10,000 is a difficult but reachable threshold. 60,000 seems 60,000 seems really high, given what I know has gone into the petition efforts to get 10,000. 60,000 seems like a really high bar to cross. But let's confirm that. Mr. Stegman?
Sorry, just a point of clarification. Is it the committee's intention to move both the amendment and the charter amendment?
It is not the committee's intention to pass these amendments today.
Okay.
I believe, well, Councilman
So
Burnett can speak
I
for
wanted to put this up on second reader. I just thought it was more appropriate to present it on the floor of the council for full review. It's something of this magnitude. I mean, the reason we picked a bar this high as well was this is something that we don't want to be, we want it to be the will of the people. We want it to be reflective of a large consensus that something needs to be done. And we thought having the highest bar possible in both raising the threshold for the council vote to remove an elected official as well as to trigger the process was appropriate, so that it would be more reflective of the will of the people, similar to what we heard in the outcome of the last administration. And I know the folks are itching. I just want to have an opportunity to lay out the political reasons for doing this. And some of the feedback I got was that we did not want this to be, the bar to be so low that it was used as a political tool to wield, if someone's running against an elected official they don't like, they just trigger this process over and over again as a way to just sort of use it as a baton or bat, I guess, but not necessarily being reflective of the voters of Baltimore City.
Since both of the representatives from the law department have expressed an interest in speaking, I'm going to call on Mr. Stegman, and the two of you can work out which order you should speak in.
And I'm sorry, just again to clarify, so is the intention for this committee to take action on the charter amendment today, and then for these amendments to be offered to the full council?
Monday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
May I make a suggestion? I think so I understand that that this amendment, the reasoning for it is based on feedback that you have heard at the public meetings. I think that the specific wording is something that the law department has just seen today, that the other city agencies, city entities that may be impacted have not had a chance to review. And again, the idea is something that has come from the public, but I don't think there has been an opportunity for public comment on this specific proposal. If the committee is open to it, I would suggest that maybe you hold. I know that the committee does have future work sessions on sort of the charter as a whole, that maybe this would be something that would be appropriately discussed in that forum.
I have no objection to that.
Mine's just a clarifying question, just to make sure that I understand what's going on here. This is an or, so we are preferring charges by, or we can do the first things, or we can get 20% of the voters to sign a petition bringing charges against somebody. Is that correct? Is that how I interpret
Yeah, it's an
this thing?
or, yeah.
Okay.
My concern is, I would agree with Matthew that I would like a chance to just vet it real quickly through with the constitutional requirements for removal from office, because I had suggested amendments that to conform the language to the Constitution, and we can do it both ways. I think we discussed this at the hearing on this bill, that there are certain things that would subject the elected official to removal by operation of law under the Constitution, and then there are other things that could be subject to removal by the city council, but they have to be separate. And you can't remove for something that the Constitution requires removal as by operation of law. So I think there needs to be an opportunity to jive the two, and then I want to make sure that the 20% doesn't somehow raise a red flag with respect to a special election. But I don't think it would, but I'd like the opportunity to check that out.
And for clarity, I can read the constitutional amendment regarding referenda. It's not artfully worded, so it lends itself to some interpretation. But on my reading, it says that the petition shall be signed by not less than 20% of the registered voters of a city or county, provided, however, that in any case, 10,000 signatures shall be sufficient to complete a petition. So I think my reading of that is, that the 10,000 is a minimum, whereas you have to get the 20%.
Oh, I see what you mean about the. It's not that.
I think it takes into account some smaller jurisdictions
It's
that
not
might
less
not
than.
have that threshold.
Right, exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. You've now given me a separate research project as to whether our local board of elections has been inaccurately applying that standard. But I will, that's has nothing to do with the work of this committee. Okay, well then I'm going to leave that up to the sponsor of the amendment, the actual charter amendment. Do you wish to move forward?
Yeah, let's hold.
Oh, let's hold. Okay. So we're gonna set 19381 aside for now, and we're gonna move to Bill 19-0441, Charter Amendment, Charter Review Commission. I don't believe we have any amendments from this. Is that true? So, in the absence of any submitted amendments, do I have a motion to move 19-0441?
Make a motion.
Moved by Councilman Burnett. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilwoman McCray. Mr. Johnson?
Member Henry,
Yes.
Member Burnett,
Yes.
Member McCray. This bill will come out for second reader on Monday, March 9th.
Okay. And then last but not least, we have City Council 19-0467, Charter Amendment vetoes timing of override. I believe we have an amendment for that one that would clarify the issue raised by the Law Department to make certain that it is not expected that this would transcend council terms. I know you had the amendment for Ryan's timing.
That was the only one.
That was the only copy?
No, there's
Oh, no, but where is the actual stack of amendments? Because I'm having trouble putting my hands on it. This is for 380. This is also for 380. That was for 489. I believe you. I don't know where it went. Are they up? 489? That's it. I think that's it, right?
No, 467 is what we're looking at.
467. Do you have? I brought them down. 467? Yeah. Oh, they're. Thank you. All right. 2 going this way. All the rest going this way. While those are being distributed, notwithstanding paragraph 2 of this subsection, no vetoed ordinance or resolution may be reconsidered by a city council that has been newly elected and sworn since the passage of the vetoed ordinance or resolution. Okay. So, do I have a motion on this amendment? Oh, I'm sorry, and just to clarify, from the original hearing on this bill, the law department had raised the concern that the way it was originally drafted, it would allow a newly sworn-in city council to override a veto by a previous mayor of an ordinance elected by a previous an ordinance passed by a previous council if the first meeting of the new council was the first meeting since the veto. And we confirmed with the sponsor of the charter amendment that that was not his intent and that he was fine with an amendment clarifying so, and so that's what we have before us.
I move the amendment.
Moved by Councilman Burnett. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilwoman McCray. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the amendment passes.
I move the amended bill.
Moved by Councilman Burnett. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilwoman McCray.
Member Henry,
Yes.
Member Burnett,
Yes.
Member McCray. This charter amendment will come out for second reader on March 9th.
Okay. Today's business of the committee is concluded. Thank you very much for your time. Please check the area around your seat to make certain that you are taking with you everything you brought with you. Thank you again for joining us here in the council chambers at this time.